Horror games are a delicate balance. On one side of that balance, we have the in-your-face, punchy, visceral, and over-the-top projects. These games are full of jump scares and seek to get a big reaction from the player. These usually lend themselves to YouTube playthroughs, where the enjoyment is derived from seeing the player jump rather than be unsettled. I tend to refer to these types of games as peaks and valleys. The horror is usually up and down throughout the course of our journey, moments of quiet followed by large spikes of fear. But this is momentary fear. On the other side of that balance, we have the persistent, atmospheric, biting horror, the ones that last. Games on this side usually seek to create an atmosphere, a terrifying and constant fear, one that sinks into the bones. This is meant to unsettle the player, rather than make them jump out of their seat. The terror seeks to make you think, to make you worry about what's around the corner, and the idea of that is more terrifying than if something actually screamed in your face. In my opinion, the best horror games manage to find a middle ground between these two. They successfully walk the tightrope rather than falling off to one side. These games toe the line, providing the player with both a fantastic atmosphere, one that develops tension over the course of its story, and high-intensity environment that keeps us on our toes. Condemned Criminal Origins is one of these games, a game that both creates fear through tension and absence of high energy, and then moments later, that same intensity that's void once held fear. The game flows back and forth between these two states seamlessly, creating something else, something that manages to terrify and create a gritty and disgusting environment all its own. So, since it's October, I'd like to take a look at this game. We'll be taking a deep dive into Condemned, talking about gameplay, mechanics, and everything in between. If you enjoy the video and want to support the channel, you can do so by liking this video and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps me out. You can also subscribe to the Patreon, where I upload longer versions of my full series retrospectives and provide early access to my videos. Spoilers for Condemned Criminal Origins. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Condemned Criminal Origins. Condemned Criminal Origins was developed by Monolith Productions and published by Sega. At the time, Monolith had become known for their first-person shooters, games like Blood, Tron 2.0, Contract Jack, and the Fear series had led them to popularity. They also, interestingly, developed The Matrix Online, the MMO that ran for 4 years before being shut down due to having a small user base. Fear had actually only been released 1 month before Condemned, so they were clearly trying their hand at a new genre here. Condemned was meant to be a launch title for the Xbox 360. Because of that, the game was being sold around the advancements in game technology more than for the game itself. This usually comes with the territory though, as launch games are really meant to sell a system rather than just a game. This doesn't mean that the game didn't have impressive tech for the time though. The team had a realistic set of physics, advanced AI, and a dynamic lighting system that they felt was very important to the atmosphere of the environments. The game was announced in February of 2005 and later shown off at E3 in May. Frank Rook, the game's writer and lead designer, took a ton of inspiration from film and TV for the game. He cited specifically things like Jacob's Ladder, Silence of the Lambs, and Seven as films that influenced the story, as well as shows like The X-Files. Monolith themselves also researched the psychology of serial killers for the project to ensure that there was some accuracy in the characterization. They even went as far as hiring surveyors to scout out real-life abandoned and condemned buildings to base their environments on. David Hassel, Condemned's producer, said that the team was focusing on 3 types of horror: shock, tension, and psychology. The team really wanted the combat to shine. They wanted it to be something new and interesting, but they also wanted it to serve the purpose of horror. Because of this, they based most encounters around close quarters combat, putting the enemies in the player's face. Frank Rook stated that, "We didn't mess it up with a bunch of combos. It's just a basic, raw, primal kind of fight that you would expect in this setting." There was also an original plan for the game which was actually cut. The first setup for the game saw us playing a government agent with powers who could pull weapons from enemies with telekinesis. At that time, the game was actually called The Dark. Condemned: Criminal Origins was released for the Xbox 360 on November 22, 2005 in North America and ported to PC on April 11, 2006. Before we begin, I just want to quickly note that I played Condemned on the Xbox Series S using the backwards compatibility feature that system offers. I originally was going to play the PC version of the game, but after playing it for a couple of hours and suffering some stuttering issues and resolution problems, I decided to go with the console version. Now, to be clear, this isn't to say that the PC version is bad or doesn't work. Based on everything else I've read and heard, the PC port is actually very good. I would assume that the problems I experienced were specific to my machine and individual issues, rather than issues you'd experience across the board. Condemned begins with our main character, Ethan Thomas, pulling up in his car to a crime scene. Ethan is a part of the Serial Crimes Unit. He specifically investigates serial killers and has been following one for a while now, called the Matchmaker. Once we arrive at the scene, Ethan meets up with Detective Dickinson. He guides us through the abandoned building where the body has been found. Inside, we're contacted by Lieutenant Rosa, the lab tech that Ethan works with, and who will be a large help throughout the game. Ethan will be able to make use of a wireless transfer system that allows him to transmit data back to Rosa at her lab, where she interprets it and gives us the details. Investigating the scene of the crime, we see that there are eyes painted across the walls, faceless child mannequins standing off to the side, and a male mannequin positioned across from where the body lay on the floor. Looking into the details, we find out that the woman on the floor was strangled with a hand that's missing its index finger. During this, Ethan begins to see visions of someone altering the face of a mannequin. We use the laser light to find the male mannequin's face adjusted, featuring scarring across the left side of his jaw. This is the Matchmaker's signature mark. He kills women and then places them in a scene with a department store mannequin whose face is disfigured. Now, we find all of this out by using the investigation tools. Condemned doesn't just feature intense, fast-paced combat, it also showcases a detective system. At certain points, Ethan will need to use a variety of equipment at his disposal to either track someone down or uncover more clues to solve the mystery at hand. These can be a laser light that shows us substances of note, a UV light that can pick up fingerprints, or just our regular old camera. These moments are, for the most part, a breath of fresh air. After dealing with waves of enemies and barely making it out alive, they represent a calm point in the darkness, a moment where we can focus on the story and not the hordes of psychos trying to kill us. After we fully investigate the crime scene, Detective Dickinson smells smoke, which he at first mistakes of the officer on duty sparking up a cig. He quickly realizes the source is somewhere else. Dickinson tracks the culprit to the next floor up, where he and Becker soon run to. Ethan has to take the current floor, but Dickinson and Becker warn Ethan that there are junkies, possibly hopped up on some new drug inside the building. Before we move forward, we should probably talk about the combat of Condemned: Criminal Origins. Condemned features mostly melee-based fighting mechanics, despite what the game would have you think when taking down your first enemy. We do have access to guns, and we will find many throughout our playthrough, but ammo is very limited. We can't find ammo out in the world like other games. There aren't just boxes of free bullets spilled across every map that we journey through. The only bullets that we find are inside the guns themselves. Once a gun is out of bullets, we can use it as a blunt object until it breaks, but we then have to let it go until we find another one. Most of the time, we'll be taking on enemies with objects that we find throughout the world. These could be quite normal things that one would think to use to defend themselves, like a shovel or a fire axe. But sometimes we have to make do with what we've got. Ethan will get himself in sticky situations and be forced to use whatever is nearest to him to survive. This can lead to us wielding signs, mannequin arms, or conduits ripped off the wall. This weapon design lends to the feeling that the game tries to portray, one of survival. Condemned truly is a survival horror game because that's the genuine way that it makes us feel. We spend most of the game in dingy, gritty, disgusting environments. We fight off enemies that are mostly made of sewer dwellers and junkies. We take on these foes in abandoned buildings where our villains will hide around corners and fight dirty, popping out at us from around the shadows. Along with these environments and enemies, the pace of the game is just intense. We never once feel like we have it in the game. Sure, health is aplenty in Condemned, and it's pretty easy to refill our meter, so we don't really often end up in situations where we feel stuck or like we're dying constantly. But this doesn't even matter. The game is definitely not hard, but we never feel like we're doing well. We always feel like we just made it out of every level that we're in, like we barely made it through to the other side. This lends itself incredibly well to the intensity and survival aspects of the game. This feeds right back into the fear and the horror that the game presents. The environments and enemies, while disgusting, also serve to up the fear that we experience while trudging through them. They are often dark, unlit, and quiet. The tension builds as we walk through the dead areas. We're constantly wondering who or what is around the next corner, when they will appear, and what troubles will come from the dark. The AI is also fantastic for this game and is quite impressive for a game made almost 2 decades ago. The enemies will often run away from us, which doesn't seem scary at first, but they're quick. They'll hide and suddenly we've lost them. We have no idea where they are, and running around a dark room in a frantic hurry will often lead us right past them as they pop out from behind a corner. This is where the balance of Condemned's horror comes into play. We have these moments wandering through dark halls, building tension. The game toys with us, as there's no one to be found in empty rooms, except we can hear people. Sounds off in the distance, screams from enemies, buckets falling over. Then suddenly, we're in a fight. Multiple enemies are on top of us, in our face, screeching and swinging large weapons in our direction. If we manage to take them out, then we're back to another moment of quiet contemplation. 2 feelings come here. Once again, the tension, but also the suspicion that it isn't really over, that we didn't kill all of them, and there must be another left, waiting for us to pass him by so he can get the drop on us. This all works and forms its way into a wonderful symphony. Every instrument is at play to make Condemned a fantastic, intense, and terrifying experience. It's both visceral and tense at the same time, undulating back and forth between the quiet fear and the intense horror the game presents. As for the specifics of the combat system, each weapon has its own stats: damage, speed, block, and reach. Some heavier weapons like sledgehammers and fire axes will be slow and lumbering but do large amounts of damage. Other weapons like conduits and pipes will be much quicker but will do less damage and require us to strike in a much closer distance. In my opinion, this all really comes down to your playstyle. I used many different weapons throughout the course of the game, and definitely didn't notice an issue with balance. I often favored the larger weapons because I like to take enemies out with as little attacks as possible, but there really is no one path to take when it comes to combat. It's also worth noting that in certain situations we won't really have much option, and we won't have a large choice between certain weapons. We'll just need to use whatever is in front of us. We can block in combat, but the system is not my favorite. We have a block window, so when we hold down the button, our character will stop blocking in about a second. We can't just hold block, we have to time it with the enemy's attack. I found this to be a little more annoying than anything, so I rarely tried to block, favoring getting out of the way over parrying enemies' attacks. We also have a special kick button that we can use to push enemies away, but our foes are crafty and will often use this push to immediately attack. That's one of the other special parts about Condemned's combat system, is that enemies will often counter our attacks. As soon as we hit them, they're swinging again. The pace is high, so we don't really have much time to launch an offense. We have to time our attacks well, moving in and out, and trying to stay out of the way of our enemies' swings. Early on in the game, we will also get a taser, which becomes incredibly useful. This will stun enemies and allow us to steal their weapon while they're disabled. We can also just use this as an opportunity to defeat them entirely. The taser is also very useful when faced against enemies with ranged weapons, which happens more than you'd think. The first time I fought an enemy that had a gun and I didn't have a gun, I thought it was quite cheap. I just assumed this was an oversight in design, but then I realized how to deal with them. I had to run away from the enemy and take cover, waiting for them to come to me. The game actually forces you to take on the habits of the enemies that you fight, which is a genius little move. The combat system overall is great though, and like I said, gets incredibly intense, especially when we get into a fight that we didn't see coming at all. Our heart is pumping and everything is racing. It's not incredibly in-depth, but it does have its complexity. As Ethan is heading through the abandoned building, he's accosted by many enemies, but eventually is sort of reunited with Dickinson. He tosses us a fire axe to help us get out of the room. Certain weapons like fire axes, shovels, and sledgehammers can be used to get through doors. Some of these are optional and will lead to extra health or collectibles, but some are also required for story progression. Becker and Dickinson say that they're going to find a way around to meet back up with Ethan. We head through the building and are attacked by a mysterious man. He's mad that we're messing up his plan, but just as our two friends enter the door, he shoots them and pushes Ethan out the window, thus ending Chapter 1. Chapter 2 begins as Ethan wakes up on his couch. He sees something attack him in the mirror, and a strange man is in his home. He introduces himself as Malcolm Van Horn, a friend of Ethan's father. Malcolm helped Ethan get out of his sticky situation last night. It doesn't look good for Ethan here. The two detectives were killed with his weapon, and the police think that he killed them. He's being framed, and the police are on the way. They won't believe him, and he has no other choice than to work with this Van Horn character. He tells Ethan to flee and head to the metro station. As we head into the subway tunnels, Ethan has another vision of a shadowy figure taking pictures from a window. In a trash can nearby, he finds pictures of him in his apartment. He transmits these to Rosa, who is still willing to work with him. She tells Ethan that the pictures must have been developed somewhere inside of the station, so we have to track down exactly where. Nearby, we find the developing fluid that was used. Heading through the station, we eventually get a call from Malcolm. He tells Ethan that the police are ransacking his apartment right now. It doesn't matter if he's innocent because the police don't believe it yet, so we need to find proof and clear Ethan's name. More importantly, Malcolm tells Ethan that he has gifts and that he should trust his instincts. After we've made it through a couple waves of enemies, Van Horn calls us again. He says that he's been watching Ethan since his father died. He once again reiterates that Ethan's gifts are important and to pay attention to his instincts. It's clear that Ethan is different. We've already experienced a few visions at this point in the game. Ethan has some sort of intuition that gives him information normal people wouldn't necessarily have. Now, where that exactly comes from, we don't know yet. One thing worth mentioning is that there are two types of collectibles in Condemned. Throughout the gritty and dirty levels that we traverse, we can find birds and pieces of metal. There are a certain amount in each chapter, but they don't really do much. They'll give us achievements and will unlock some small extras like concept art. It's worth noting though, because one of our investigation tools is specifically made for finding decaying material and is often used to find dead birds. Eventually, we'll be tasked with tracking a trail of developing fluid. It leads back to a hidden room that contains pictures of Ethan and tapes that the culprit had been recording of private calls.
We've got to get a break in this case soon. There's been some bad luck. All of it yours, Thomas. We've got to get a break in this case soon.
We find a print that matches the one Rosa has, but it doesn't match anything on the government databases. We can actually see the camera here that the killer was using to watch Ethan. In the next room, we also find newspaper clippings hung up on the wall. Each one details a serial killer, all cases that Ethan himself worked on. Some are marked with a black pen, but Rosa can't quite make out what the pattern is yet. After this, Ethan seems to have another vision and is attacked by a man. He then vomits and sees the killer off in the distance. We have to chase him down, and on the way, Ethan sees a flock of birds crashing into the subway station windows. We then enter the door into the underground to finish off the chapter. Chapter 3 then begins in the subway proper. We eventually make it underground and head on the tracks. Ethan climbs on a train car, but it takes off. He sees the killer on the train, but is pushed off himself. Ethan is then forced to wander the subway tunnels, where we begin to encounter some peculiar enemies that don't just look like they're on drugs. We eventually catch up with the subway car and search the thing for clues. Ethan finds a print on a fire extinguisher, which allows Rosa to get a DNA profile. It's going to take a bit though, so we have to wait for her results. Outside, a massive firefighter psycho is fighting off a few enemies, and we have to take him down. These heavies are a bit harder to get rid of, but slower and more lumbering. Nearby, we find a train schedule posted with some circled stations. The two circled routes are determined to be something that the killer uses regularly. The first is Route 16 to Burnside, but the second leads to Briar, a small farming town. At this point, Rosa also gets a DNA match and determines that the man whose tail we're on is definitely the guy that killed Ethan's cop friends in the abandoned building, so we're on the right path. Ethan thinks that this is the matchmaker, but he's still not quite sure. Near the end of this level, we find a train blueprint. This is a Holman-made train, and circled on the top is a ceiling compartment. These trains have been out of commission for a while, but before we open the compartment in question, we need a crowbar, and in the back room we find that very same tool, dusted with mannequin debris, specifically from a department store. We find footprints in the car and Ethan has a vision of the mystery person using the hidden compartment. When we open it, mannequin parts fall out. We scan one of the arms to find the name of the department store that they belong to, Bart's. It just so happens that the next train scheduled to leave is the one heading to Burnside, where we need to go. Once we make it back to the train, we hear a phone call between Ethan and one of his superiors. They think he's killed the cops. They don't believe him still. They think that he's cracked, and they're recommending psychiatric help. During this, something is creeping up on Ethan, or at least he thinks it is. Once we arrive at Bart's, Van Horn calls. He's expected the pressure that the department is putting on Ethan. He tries to keep Ethan on course, ensuring that he understands that he has to keep investigating. The department store was honestly where the game took a turn for me. It took a turn from a definitely scary and intense horror game to a terrifying, heart-racing experience. We see a lot of mannequins in this store, but some of them aren't mannequins. They're some type of person that's donned a mannequin mask. We'll be walking along, minding our own business, and suddenly they'll just take a slow, measured walk off the platform to go find a weapon. One of the most terrifying things about this level is that we don't know who is who. The mannequin people also don't run around like the others that we've met so far. They don't rush towards a weapon to quickly get something to attack us with. They move slow, measured, and sure. It's much more terrifying than the junkies that were attacking us in abandoned buildings. Walking through the store, we're constantly looking around at every single upright statue, just to see if it would move. The game makes us paranoid. It doesn't want us to trust it. It's broken down all trust with its placement of scares. But that's fine. We don't need to trust this game for it to be good, and it doesn't mean to build that relationship back up. Something that furthers this idea is Condemned's lack of respect for safe moments. Generally, in horror, there are moments where the game considers us safe. These could be safe rooms, places where we can save, places where we restock on ammo. There are a couple moments in Condemned that feel like this. Story moments where we get phone calls, moments where we find health boxes, and sections where we have to do some detective work. Most of these are not respected though, meaning that we will get attacked or scared while investigating a crime scene or while getting our health back. The game cleverly doesn't show its full hand in this regard until a couple of chapters in. This makes it so that the only true safe moment is when we're listening to a phone call. Any other moment is free game. We could be attacked or scared. This ups the theme of survival that the game loves to toy with. We constantly feel on edge, looking around corners, making sure we're alone before taking a moment to breathe. Early on in the department store, we find a fingerprint in blood, a right-handed missing the index finger. This matches the print from the first crime scene, but it doesn't match the print from the tape recorder, the one that was spying on Ethan in his home. Ethan then gets a vision of the shadowy figure killing someone. We can analyze the blood splatter on the wall. Rosa tells us what we already know. This was caused by a head wound. We can use the laser sight to track more floor goo and head across the warehouse. We eventually track it to a footprint that could be from the matchmaker. Because the department store is flooded though, we can't make it through this part. Rosa suggests that we use our gas spectrometer to track the gases from decaying bodies. We track it back to another body. The killer has struck again. This time though, it doesn't seem to be the matchmaker because we have a male corpse and a female mannequin. The facial mark also doesn't line up with the matchmaker's killings. Once we look at the right hand of the body though, we realize that this is the matchmaker himself. He's missing his right index finger. Rosa finds some particles on the hand marks of the body, and she has to analyze the data for some time. Outside, a cop is killed by one of the department store inhabitants. More cops are being attacked in the lobby. They've officially taken the outside of the store, and Rosa has a new theory. Back in the office, we found newspaper clippings of Ethan's cases. 9 serial killers were mentioned, and 7 were already crossed out with an X. Two serial killers were left, the matchmaker and the torturer. Now the matchmaker is dead, so it seems like someone is targeting serial killers. The crossed out cases have gone cold. Just then, the police start to break in, and we have to make our way out. Ethan barely makes his escape into the alleyway outside. Rosa thinks that this killer that's killing killers is matching the MO of each murderer when he takes them out. This would explain why the matchmaker's body was set up the way that it was. Rosa refers to him as an Uber killer or serial killer X. The torturer, the final killer on Ethan's list, abducts people and tortures them. He then lets them loose and tries to hunt them down, driving them to take their own life. Now Ethan has to track down the torturer and try and save him before Killer X can get to him. As messed up as it is, saving a serial killer is just the job that has to be done here.
What is this city coming to? All right, so I've got to find the torturer and save his ass so the new killer doesn't kill him?
Life of an agent.
Ethan asks Rosa if she can meet him at the city library. There, they might be able to find more information on their culprits. On our way over there, it just so happens that there are violent outbreaks in the streets. People have begun to revolt, rioting and fighting against the police. We come down in the middle of this fight and have to make our way through. Ethan barely makes it onto a dumpster that rolls into the alleys nearby. He tries to hide from a cop, and Rosa almost gives up his position.
Shit, what the hell was that?
Thomas, I'm at the library. Where are you?
We make it to the city library, and on our way down the elevator, Ethan has a vision of a train car. A figure turns to rats and rushes him before he's back on the elevator again. We find Rosa in the library. There was a fire in the building previously, though, and the place has been abandoned, so squatters and addicts have made it their home. Rosa also has a file on Ethan that she found in the archives. During his last physical, the doctor found many abnormalities. Ethan has an absurdly dense bone structure, unassumingly explaining the game's mechanics and combat, but he also has some hyperactivity in his brain. There was also something in his x-ray that's been redacted. The file has an addendum that's highly classified, something that the government doesn't want anyone to see. Ethan is clearly special, mentally and physically. Something much larger is going on here, though. The government is interested in Ethan, which is very peculiar. There's a bigger mystery going on behind the scenes, one that we aren't privy to yet. Here, Rosa also gives us access to a higher-leveled taser, which makes the tool much more efficient. Ethan begins immediately having visions in the building. We're scammed into thinking that enemies are attacking, but no one is there. We try to get access to the library server to get more information on the torturer, but the server is down. Ethan then sees a vision of Rosa being captured and wakes up to find her gone. We eventually find her phone in the server room, where we find out that a terminal in the rare books section of the library is being used. Arriving there, we find Rosa, who is still knocked out. She uses the search engine to find a match for the DNA to the serial killer X. The killer was trying to look for information on the torturer, and he made Rosa look the information up. The engine gives us a name, Carl Anderson, and a school that we have to head to. Rosa and Ethan get separated, and Ethan begins having more visions. We lead Rosa into the basement and find the information we're looking for, but someone is watching. They find the location that Carl Anderson was sent to and are alerted to the presence of Killer X. On exiting the library, Rosa and Ethan decide to head to the school, since Killer X is probably on his way there now. Van Horn has found Ethan at the school, which he chalks up to coincidence. Inside the school, we find a grotesque new enemy littering the place. Ethan also sees a pair of lips that have been set on a blackboard with the phrase "loose lips sink ships" written above. The lips belong to a teacher, Samuel Tibbets, who we now have to find. We end up having to defeat a sort of pseudo-boss, a woman that wields a butcher knife. Once we kill her, we can use the knife to cut free a fire axe, which helps us progress through the school. We end up in the gym, where turning the power on lowers a basketball hoop. An arm is connected to this hoop, belonging to one Samuel Tibbets. The torturer already got to him. We head through a hole in the floor that leads outside. We soon get a call from Van Horn, who wants us to meet out front after we're finished. Ethan then sees a vision of a strange man killing him. Entering another building in the school, we see someone climbing into a locker. When we find this locker, the person speaks to Ethan, begging him for help. He says that someone took Carl Anderson, the torturer, away. Ethan is then trapped inside the locker, while something goes on a rampage outside, but this is just a vision. Rosa comes in with some info on the chemicals that the killer has been using. It seems to be used for crops, specifically apples. There might be an apple orchard in Briar, the farming town that the killer was traveling to via subway. We make it into a school pool where Ethan has to fight off waves of enemies in a world-ending vision. Ethan is then confronted by the strange monster in another vision where he's tossed into the wall. As we're about to leave, Rosa tells us the address of the Briar Apple Orchard, and Van Horn is waiting outside. Van Horn takes us to the apple orchard. He explains that he feels a responsibility to help the investigation and Ethan. Ethan thinks that he's a circus freak to the Bureau and that he wasn't actually a good detective. Van Horn seems to know things that he's keeping from Ethan, a lot more than Ethan himself. He drops Ethan off at the orchard and we see someone inside watch the two arrive. Inside the house, it's our goal to solve the riddle that's written on the walls. We can use our tools to follow a path of symbols written through the entire place. We have to find 4 different ones, which eventually leads us into the attic, where we have to fight a particularly difficult creature. The riddle will lead us to a mirror with a hidden door behind it. Inside, we find a newspaper clipping about Ethan. The papers include internal bureau letters about his promotions. He's been following Ethan very closely for a long time, and Rosa thinks it's because he's chosen Ethan as an adversary, but he thinks there's more to this. We can hear noise coming from upstairs at this point, and a piano is pushed down the steps. We need to defeat enemies until we find a fire axe so we can destroy the piano. Once we get upstairs, Ethan sees a vision of a man being impaled. This is the torturer, and we find his body in a room nearby. Just then, the Bureau calls Ethan. They've revoked his lab access and want to stop his investigation. Ethan moves the body and takes the poker out of it. While this happens, we hear what Serial Killer X said to the torturer as he killed him. Killer X then attacks us. We have to chase him around the upstairs of the house and hit him a few times before winning this short boss battle. Ethan is knocked down during this exchange by Van Horn. We find out that Serial Killer X's real name is Leland, and this man is his uncle. He tries to talk some sense into Leland, but he kills him. We're then kidnapped by the killer. The killer reveals his plot at this point. He was using us, using Ethan to track down the killers. We were a pawn, leading him to every single kill. But Leland is planning on putting an end to this, but he can't decide which killer's methods he wants to use. During this speech, Ethan sees a creature up in the rafters. Leland's uncle jumps in and takes him out as the barn catches fire. He says that we have to destroy it, that it has caused all this madness. We're not sure what this it is at this point, but we can use flaming boards to keep the darkness at bay, making our way out of the barn. As Ethan heads out onto the farm, he hears a voice telling him that he belongs to them. We have to make our way across this dimly lit place, weaving in and out of the shadows. When we reach the final building, the creature stands above and enemies flood in. We have to fend them off and eventually fight the creature itself. We take it out on the roof and are eventually transported to a sort of nether world in Ethan's visions. Ethan destroys the creature and the barn begins to burn down, but Ethan makes it out. He shouts for Malcolm outside and the man comes to his rescue. Ethan can't go back to his old life, not only because the police think that he is guilty, but also because Ethan has stared into the face of the hate, of pure evil. Van Horn tells Ethan that the hate is inside of him as well now. Ethan thinks that he sees something behind them and asks Malcolm to stop the car. Malcolm then defends the killer, saying that he isn't responsible. He stops on the side of the road and Leland is still alive. Malcolm was clearly involved in this. He was covering up for his nephew, Leland. Something tried to take control of them, but Leland wasn't strong enough, and he succumbed to whatever was taking them over. Malcolm has been fighting to save him. He thinks that Leland has a chance for redemption, just like Ethan does. He then pulls a gun to try and shoot Ethan, but the scene changes as beings appear around him, and Leland is in the trunk of a car. We have a 5-second choice to save Leland or to take him out for good, but it doesn't matter what we choose because Leland dies either way. We then see Ethan in a diner drinking, and Rosa meets up with him. She asks him first why he's laying low. Ethan's been cleared of the murders but suspended. Rosa has been looking into the murders and she's found that a cult has been behind everything. She can't find anything on Leland Van Horn though. Rosa thinks that Leland wasn't working alone. She asks Ethan if he knows anyone else that was connected to them. She then slides a note to him that indicates that she is wearing a wire. The police are investigating Ethan again, trying to find more information and possibly further implicate him. We then finally see Ethan head into the bathroom to look into the mirror, but he throws up in the sink and sees the creature behind him in the mirror before his face changes to the same. This is the end of our tale and sets up the next game in the series. The story of Condemned is alright, and I kind of have a love-hate relationship with it. It's not the strongest part of the game. I do think that honor lies in gameplay and atmosphere. The story does have some holes for sure, but I do think it has its merits. First of all, a horror game based around a police investigation into serial killers is a good idea on its face. Often horror games revolve around hell worlds, demons, or zombies, and sure, Condemned does reveal its paranatural elements at the end of its runtime, but it starts out mostly based in reality. It feels a lot more grounded and a lot more realistic for its first half. It plays with both worlds a little bit, and the more grounded version of it is a lot more interesting. Like I said though, it has its downsides. The way that certain information is delivered can be a bit clunky. How Ethan's powers or gifts are explained halfway through the game with a folder that's given to us by Rosa certainly feels odd. Some of the beats are bland, and the ending can seem a bit forced. The game also definitely leaves some details vague. Whether purposeful or an oversight on the part of the writers, it leaves the audience wondering what exactly is going on at some points. Some of this does lend to the mystery of the story, but a lot of it just ends up leaving the player in unnecessary confusion. Overall, I think my opinion lands on the side of the good, though. I think a lot of the ideas that Condemned presents are really interesting and definitely stands out in the history of horror games. Condemned is a powerhouse of horror. It balances and manages both incredibly and equally important aspects of horror very well. This automatically puts it a cut above the rest, in the great category of horror games. But the things that Condemned does with tension, atmosphere, combat, and sound are all top-notch. The game constantly manages to terrify over and over again. We almost feel like a fool for being so scared of the game, like we've reverted back to a childlike state and are watching a scary movie alone at night. It almost feels silly, but it just works. It manages to terrify us even when we're expecting it, something that's incredibly difficult to do in a horror experience. The melee combat combined with the first-person view creates an incredibly visceral environment. We barely get the chance to deal with enemies from afar. We can't pick people off, defeating hordes as they make their way to us. We have to deal with foes inches from our face. We have to contend with the vicious soldiers of this world up close and personal. This bumps the intensity of every fight up a notch. Combine this with the dingy environments, the grotesque undergrounds, beneath sewers and inside of abandoned buildings. These are all disgusting, unlit places. The people jumping out from around corners fit in with these places. It all just makes sense. The environment, sounds, tension, fear, horror, and combat all create something truly great. It's one of those things that may not really look like something special from the outside, but the true nature of this beast can only really be felt once it's been interfaced with. Once Condemned wraps its tendrils around us, we begin to realize the unique state that this game exists in and its spot in the history of horror games. Condemned was well received upon release. Most outlets pointed out the unique nature of the game, the grotesque environments, and the visceral combat. The game currently sits at an 81 for the Xbox 360 version of the game. In North America, the game sold very well, much better than expected. Despite this though, the game wasn't a smash success and became a cult hit much later. It's now looked back on very fondly, making many outlets best of horror games lists. The game was successful enough to warrant a sequel though, but we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.